So the next thing that we want to do is we want to have Link be able to pick up the sword and then have an animation play. Link in the video game, he runs over the sword and then he picks it up, he lifts it up, he does that animation, he puts it up over his head, and then a sound plays, and then he returns to normal. We want to begin making this animation possible, and the first thing we're going to do to make this possible is we're actually going to create something called an actionable component. And this actionable component is going to be a bit complicated, but what it will allow us to do is to play animations and to have things happen in the game. It's going to follow the typical pattern that we usually use for components, with a component type and a component object in the constructor. Call the super for component type. And then the properties that it's going to have are this func and then this args. It's going to work similarly to how we're currently firing off events in the transition system. And we're going to make changes in both the game class and the screen file as well. Similarly to how we have this object here with type door, we're also going to have an object that has a type as well. And this type is going to be type act tile. And this object now is going to have some different properties than the tile that's type door. So when we have an actionable tile, we're going to have a tile, and then some kind of event is going to change it. It may be Link walking over a space, or it may be Link placing down a bomb and the bomb exploding to reveal a secret door. So we're going to have a change in what the tile is. So the first thing we're going to display is the tile before the action, and then we need to think about the replacement tile, the tile that will come after the action. So let's go into our asset folder and see what the tiles are that I'm talking about. Let's go into shop. The first tile that I'm speaking about is this sword tile. So we're going to use this tile as the thing that Link will walk over to initiate an event. And then we can simply, after Link picks up the sword, the animation fires, we can just replace it with this black tile. And all we need to do now is specify what the name of these PNG files are in this object. So since the initial tile is the sword, we're going to use this as this is going to represent the sword. I'm going to write a comment down below just so it's clear, because both PNGs have the same number. So for act tile, the tile property is for the initial tile. The replacement tile, or let's call this tile 2 property, for the replacement tile. You could write out replacement tile, but I'm going to just use tile 2 because it's a short name, and I want to be able to keep this two-dimensional array looking kind of like how the screen should look. I don't want to make it out of proportion or make it look ugly, so I'm going to keep it like that. And now we're going to go to the index.js. And what we're going to do is we're going to handle this kind of type. So here we're handling if the type is a door. So let's handle else if type is equal to act tile. So now that we get in here, we need to know that we want to fire off the sword animation. And in our video game, we're going to have many kinds of actionable tiles. Unfortunately, this simple object isn't actually telling us which one of the actionable tiles we're dealing with. It tells us that it's an actionable tile, but we need to have some kind of way to know what one it is, right? So let's add a second type, and we can call this event type, and we'll just write sword-1. And in here, we can now set up our sword-1 animation. So let's get this event type, const event type from tile. And we're also going to need tile and tile2. And to avoid confusion, I will just call this tile1. There we go. And if event type is equal to sword1, do animation, create the actionable component. Good. Now remember, this whole block, this happens on initialization. So this is the first second that the game begins to show the shop level, this will be created. Now, before we get ahead of ourselves and create the actionable component, what I want to remember is that we need to show the tile1, but then after, and let me fix that typo, after the animation fires, we're going to be removing tile1 and showing tile2. So this is going to be directly affected by the path. So if I need to create, right? We need to create some kind of flag that will determine whether we go to the actionables path for tile 1 or for the normal path of just tiles for tile 2. So the last thing that we're going to have in this object is just, we'll call it remove, and we'll set it to false. It will be our remove flag. So let's pull this out. So if remove, we're going to set the path to one thing, and if not, we're going to set it to another thing. So if remove is true, then we will have just a normal tile. But if it's not true, then we will have actionable tiles. And we will set tile to tile 1, while this will be set, or no, this will be set to tile 2, and in actionable tile we'll be using tile 1. And we can also move this in here, I believe, as well, because we only ever need this when we are showing the actionable tile anyway. So now that we got our foundation set up, we can move along and begin to create this animation component. However, we're not going to be able to get too far without actually creating the animation itself, but let's begin by just sketching out what the component is going to look like. So I'll make a comment. Now it's going to look like dummy actionable component, and it will follow the same pattern we've been using. And when it gets to value, it's going to be args, and it will be an array, or rather an object of arguments, while the function is going to be of type function. And this function is going to be the sword pickup animation function. And how we're going to use this is we're going to do event bus and essentially pass the args and the function. This is going to be done in the actionable system. That's how we're going to do this, right? Now, we need to sketch out what the function requires and therefore what the arguments will be. And with those things in mind, then we'll actually be able to build out this actionable system and incorporate it into both the game class as well as the registry class. So I know the game pretty well. I know that this function, this animation, requires a few things. Now, I'm going to sketch this out in a file, and I think I'm going to add a file. Well, I could add it in here where we have link animation. And I'm going to do link pickup sword 1. And this is going to be a function. And I'll export it right off the bat. So a few of the things that we're going to need, I know for a fact that we are going to need Link himself. We're going to need Link as the player. So I can already pass that in. I know that this args is going to contain the player. And because this block of code is within the game class, we can easily put this player into this argument. That's very easy. Now, the next thing that I may need is, and I'll write this up here, I'm going to need the registry. Luckily, the player already has a copy of the registry. And we're going to need the registry because I have a feeling after we are done with the animation, we're going to want to add the tile that we no longer need to the entities to be killed property within the registry, and then we're going to get rid of that tile. So we have registry. That's good. The next thing I think that we will need is the handle user input function. And the reason why is because in that video game, when Link picks up the sword, he cannot move. He's frozen in place. Therefore, we need to put a pause on the user putting in commands so that way Link's animation is not interrupted. So we can add that in here. Handle user input. And again, that's going to be very easy because the game class has direct access to this function. And once the user freezes, he picks up the sword. We already talked about destroying the tile, and that actually brings me to something else that we need. We need the tile itself, so we need that actionable tile. And that will be a little bit tricky because the way we have set up our architecture, if you go here, you can see that the tile actually has not yet been created, and we don't have it until you come down here and the entity is already here. So with this problem, we are put into a bit of a weird situation. Now, what we could do is we could actually, if we go into system, I know we haven't created the actionable system yet, but if you just imagine, if we're using the transition system as an example, you can see right here that this is where we're actually creating the event and we're passing the arguments in. Now, we could easily just pass the ID, or excuse me, we could pass the entity into these args, but I actually don't like that solution because I would think that the best pattern would be one that we can maintain across time, and I don't want to get away from the pattern we've already set up. So I think a reasonable thing to do actually would be to incorporate the ID of the entity instead, because we can pass in this ID because we know what the ID of the entity will be up here. The entities that are being created from the registry create entity class, or from the create entity method, every time we fire this, the num of entities increments, if you remember. So what we can do is we could actually just go in here and say this registry num of entities, or whatever the name of that property is. Now, in the registry system, we do not yet have any way of getting an entity by an ID, but we can, and that's a very common thing to be able to do in the registry class. So registry get entity by ID. And how we can do this is we can take an ID, and we can also pass a system. Now, we could do this in a few different ways. We could have the registry go through every single system that it has to determine or to find the specific entity. But since we know that it's going to be in the actionable system, we can simply just do something like, and this is pseudocode, I'll write this out properly later. If system has ID, return, entity of ID, it's something like that. Now, that's not obviously the exact code again, but this is just pseudocode to help us remember. So, done in registry. So, cool. We have the ID. And because of that, we'll just get rid of actionable tile. Then we will have to think about the replacement tile as well. So we need to think about, once we get rid of this old tile, we have the animation file fire, and then we need to create the replacement tile and put it down. Where is it going to be? We need to know the position that the tile is going to be at, right? So we're going to need to have new tile position component. And we can easily get this as well too, since it's actually just going to be the same tile, the same position as the old tile. So to do this, we can just do new tile position component. And we can just use the values we had used to make the dummy position component up here. Where is it? Or down here. There we go. And it's going to be pretty much the same exact thing. There we go. And the last thing we need to remember to add as well, we need to remember how the event bus works, and we want this to immediately fire upon any interaction, any overlap of the actionable tile and link. So we just need to add event time is equal to 0. This won't be used in this animation, but it's going to be used when we fire the event, or when we push the event into the event bus, I should say, and the event is then fired. The event will be fired up here. Just let me control find it. There we go. It'll be fired right here. So now, what we will finally do is we're going to create the animation. To begin, go into the animations.js file where we have link pickup sword. And we can think about this linearly. We'll start with when Link walks over. The first frame that occurs is Link holding the sword. So we need to get the sword sprite. Let's go into the link.png, because even though I call it link.png, it has all of the items in it as well. And if we scroll down, we see the 4 swords are right here. We have this up sprite that we'll be using for the sword, and then we also have Link holding up the sword right here. So the first thing I want to do is I would like to actually create the sword entity, because we're going to have a position for the sprite as well as a sprite component for the entity, right? It's going to have a position and a sprite component. So let's get the sprite for this sword. So the first thing I'm going to do is const dummy sprite component is equal to name sprite and then value. And if you remember, takes an src, and within that src, it has 4 properties: x something, y something, height something, with something. Just judging from how far away the link sort is, the very first sprite, we're pretty much at 0, 0, 0, x, 0, y. This is pretty far down. I mean, it's about 3 columns down, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns down, more or less. The columns aren't exactly spaced out uniformly, so we might need to play around with some of the values to see exactly where it is. I think each sprite is about 20 pixels wide. So if we go 20, 40, 60, 20, 40, 60, we can go and use 60 as a starting value. We'll start with that to see. And since we're counting by 20, I don't believe it's going to be exactly uniform again, because if you can see, they don't line up properly. These animations with Link swinging his sword are a little bit longer in height than the width is. So we can use 20 and maybe just a little bit more. So why don't we do 25, 50, 75, 100, 125, 150, 175. Let's just start off with that to determine if that's correct. And this sprite, finally, this sprite looks a little longer than it is wide. So why don't we start off with 20 and 30 and 20, height 30, width 20. So that's the SRC rect. Now we need the path. So the path will be just simply link.png. Okay. Next, we're going to need a position component for this sword. Position component. We can pretty much take the player's position and change it just by a little bit, because we're going to have it over Link's head. So we're going to have it over Link's head as he's holding it up right here, and he's also holding it with one arm. That arm is his right. It's to the left for us because we're looking at it from our perspective, but it's his right hand. So we can kind of use the player X, and, we could just subtract just a little bit. So why don't we just subtract 8? Again, I'm not sure if this is the exact value. And then for height, we can subtract a little bit as well, because, again, it's over his head. I think we could start off with maybe 40, because then let's set the height to about 40 and the width to 30, or rather, let's do 30 and 20, just like this down here. And from this, we can create the sword entity. So let's try that now. So let's do this player registry, because we have, again, we have access to the registry. Create entity, dummy position component, dummy sprite component. Let's go back to index.js. And actually we have a transition space. I want to test this. So in order to test it, why don't we set up our actionable system? So we can do class actionable system extends system. Follow the pattern, system type, super system type. This component requirements, it's going to be equal to actionable. And again, just like how we're doing in both the transition system and the render system, when we call update, we're going to loop through the entities that the system has to see if it intersects with the player at all. Player. So if player, and we'll wrap this in an if statement. Let's get the entity. So if, and why don't we just very simply, we can just copy this. I can even copy from the transition system because it's more similar. In the action space. And before we push it to the event bus, why don't we just do this? And comment that out. And then why don't we try to fire this? And actually, I put it with this player. It's not this player, it's just player. So why don't we fire this, link pickup sword 1, and just pass in player for the moment. This isn't how we're going to end up doing it, but for right now, let's just leave it like this. And sword entity, go back into link pickup sword. Let's just console.log out the sword entity. Very good. Whew, okay, I hope I didn't lose you. I know we just went through some of that really quick. Take a moment, if you must, to pause it and kind of look at the files. After you're done doing that, make sure you export the actionable system. And we're going to go to our registry class. And currently we need to make sure that we're handling both the registry system and the we need to make sure we're handling the actionable system as well as the actionable component. So const component object value. Just make sure I'm spelling that right. I am. New entity components actionable is equal to new actionable component name component object, and I need to import the actionable component. Go to the actionable.js file, make sure you export that, and then import it into registry.js. Oops. Okay. Finally, go to index.js. Let's add this system to the initialization function, actionable system. And I just realized, let me double check. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I need to also add the actionable system to the add system function in registry.js. So actionable system, new system is equal to new actionable system, and we pass the system type. Make sure you write your break. Don't forget about the break. Now this should work. Just double check, make sure that it's the same string. Also, guys, real quick, I know I'm just writing out strings. I do that because I'm confident that I don't make many typing errors when I'm focusing. If you would like, you can also set these as constants and then just reuse them. That probably would be the best way to go if this was a production, like a game that was slated for a real production and distribution. But because this is just a video on YouTube, I'm not setting it as constants. Just a little advice if you guys do want to use this to build out games in the future, whether that's to continue building out this Legend of Zelda game or to use these techniques. Please use constants when you set the names of the systems and the components. It can prevent bugs in the future. Aside from that, let's get the system, and we will get the actionable system, and we do update, and we pass this player. So, okay, we just did a lot. Take a breath again if you need it. But then when you're ready, let's go to the screen and let's test this out. Oh, it seems like we have an error. Let's see where it is. Can't get the sprite. Interesting. Let's go back. Judging from that error, since it was not rendering at the door, I believe the problem is most likely within this block of code. The problem is, I see it now, we need to set tile equal to tile.tile. We also need the path to be actionable tiles. Let's see how that looks now. All right, it looks good. No problems yet. Let's open up the console. I have a feeling that picking up the sword might not work yet. Yeah. See, we can run over it, but there's no interaction. So let's go back to our game and see what's going on. Let's go to our system. And in the actionable system, let's see what's going on. We are attempting to calculate collision. We have a console.log in the action space. However, we don't seem to be getting that in here. So there must be something going wrong with detecting the collision. This looks right to me. It seems like we're getting the entity. We're calling or destructuring the properties from both the player and the entity. We're using the normal comparison. It looks like by all metrics, this should be at least hitting this console.log. Now we have the actionable component requirements. Let me go into my registry, actionable system, actionable component. Okay, we also need to add this break, so good thing we found that. Let me go back to index.js. You know what? Actually, we most likely have not added the dummy. Yep, we did not add the dummy component. Okay, so this is the next step we need to do. And luckily, past Jake was very nice to us, and he already wrote out how this dummy component should look. So let's take this. We can just copy it, and I'll just pull it out of this comment. Actionable. Let's just make sure we have all of our combos that we need. Double check that it matches how we want the actionable component to look. Args, yes. And we need the func now. So we can uncomment that func. And what is the function that we're going to fire? Well, we're going to fire the sword pickup animation. So let's take this. We'll import it into this file. Just like that. And let's push this dummy actionable component into the components array. Just like that. Okay, so now that should work, or at least it should get us to call this function. Because if you see in here, we're going to be calling it right here. Although we don't need to do that. Let's actually comment that out. And now we will use this event bus. Let's get the actionable component. So const actionable equal to player component, or actually it's entity components actionable, and we'll pull out the args and func from actionable, and we can easily just drop these properties in, and we can push this event. And now if we go to the event bus, if we look, it should be called. So let's see what we get. Looking at this function, it looks okay, although I need to get rid of the this. If you guys have this values, please delete them like I just did. So we'll go to the screen now. Oh, but one last thing, actually. I have a bad habit of doing this. We don't need that. Now I think we're good to test it. Okay. In the action space, that's good. Event bus is not defined. That's because we did not pass it to the system. Go to here, go to the actionable system, pass this event bus. Go to system.js, pass event bus. Let's go back to our screen. Cool. Okay, we're getting something different now. Let's see. Okay, fail to execute draw image. This is good though. We have our sword entity here. So aside from the errors, which we will fix, it just looks like we have the wrong path for the image. So that's okay. We know how to fix that. We can go back into our text editor. And here we have our path. And it's supposed to be, let's see, I think it's assets, link PNG. I think that's how it's supposed to be. Let's try this again. Okay, cool. We're creating the sword entity. Now nothing's happening on the screen, but we know and we can see by our console that the sword is being created and that there are no current errors with our code that we have at the moment. That's good. Let's scroll down really quickly. And since we're just testing out this screen, for ease of use, I want to just load link right into the screen when I refresh. I don't want to have to constantly run into the shop. So why don't we go to where that screen is being loaded up in the index.js. And in this line, we can just change this to shop. So make sure you import the shop. Luckily, again, my text editor helps me. You go to screen.screen.js, export this, and then pass it right into this load screen function, and then link will just load up in the shop immediately, like that. Now, let's fix the problem of Link's sword not actually showing up. And the thing is, we're going to be using the sword in the animation. So Link will pause, he'll hold up the sword, and then he'll return to normal. This entity is going to be that sword that's in the air. And right off the bat, I can tell that the reason why we're not getting the sword is probably because there's not a valid X and Y value. We need to get the X and Y value that are in the position component. Player.components. So let's change this. Now let's go back. Ah, yes. Doesn't look good, but there it is. We can see that something is happening on the screen. That's good enough for us at the moment. And it just looks like to me that it's a little small. That's fine. We can keep it like that at the moment. I just wanted to make sure that was working. Because now what we want to do is remove the old tile and put down the new tile. So that way, once Link interacts with that sword tile, it'll disappear and its replacement tile, a black square, will then be rendered in its place. And well, how do we do this? We can think through it logically. If you go and play the NES game, you know that Link will pause. Again, as I've said many times, a sound will play, and we'll get to sounds later, but a sound will play. The game will essentially freeze while Link holds that position, and then things will resume. So what I want to do is I want to essentially stop the game, or I at least want to stop the player from putting in inputs that will move Link and kind of change the animation. We want the player to not be able to put in any inputs while this is going on. So we want it to last, the animation, we want it to last a few seconds. What we can do is we can create an end time for the animation. And we can set the end time to be 3,000 milliseconds. So 3,000 milliseconds is just 3 seconds. That might be a little long, but let's just start with that and we can adjust it as we go. When Link does this animation, if you look, he has this, I'm having trouble scrolling. He has this animation where he's holding this sword up with his hand. What we want to do is we want to get this square, this sprite right here, and change it to our entity's current src rect property. So let's get the X and Y for this sprite. Let's think about now how to get this animation over here. What we will do is we're going to create kind of like a dummy animation component, but not really. We need to specify two things. We need to specify the source rectangle from where we can grab this link from, as well as the number of frames that will be in the animation. So we're going to make an object, and we'll come right here, and we'll say, let's say it's link animation, and it's gonna have two properties. It's gonna have src rect, which we're used to seeing, and another property called num frames. And this is going to take the value of 1 because we're only going to show Link doing this single pose, and it is going to kind of mimic how we have our animation component set up currently, where we have src rect as well as current frame num frames. We need num frames and src rect. We can also take current frames and frame speed rate as well. I think actually that would be a good idea. Current frame would be 0, and then frame speed rate. It doesn't really matter. However, I know our system is expecting us to have some kind of frame speed rate defined. So let's give it the value of 3. And then for the src rect, now we need to grab this specific sprite. So I think 0 would be good, right? Because it's on the first column, while Y is a little bit more difficult to pinpoint. I know that the sword is about 175. That is where we are pulling the sword out from, which is right underneath Link here. It's not exactly underneath. So let's just play around with these values. I think 145 would probably be a good thing to mess around with. And then for Link, we set the height and width to 20. And also, this src rect needs to be in an array. And the reason it needs to be an array is because if you remember, our src rect for our animations takes an array. So there we go. Does that look good? No, we're missing. It needs to be inverse. It needs to be an array of objects. So let me fix that. Okay, very good. I'll fix the spacing so it's a little bit more clear. Okay. Now what's going to happen is we are going to take this sprite and we're going to put it onto the Link animation src property that we have in here. So if you go to components, we can see that our system, and I'll put this side by side, in our animation system, we actually go deep into this animation component. We go into animation frames where it's facing, if it's moving or attacking, and then the src rect, and we pull out the current frame based on this variable, and then we set that to sprite src rect. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to simply replace this src rect array inside the animation component. And we're going to keep it there until the animation is done, where we will then put back the original src rect. So what I'm going to do, I made this this src rect, which will be the animation. We want to also grab the original src rect. We can go directly into link animation, and we can just dive into this object itself. And that's really easy because it's within the same file as this animation is. So let's go into link animation. Let's go into value, frames, and we need the facing value, which will be up. But I'm going to change that. We're going to pull out the facing value and put that in dynamically. Then it's going to be move. And we are going to take this src rect right here. We're going to take the whole array. Let me get the facing from the player.components.animation component. Or no, it's not in the animation, sorry. It would be in the it would be in the animation component. We'll place it in here. And now theoretically, we should have the original source rectangle that we're removing, and then the link animation rectangle, which we will be applying. So now that we have that, let's try applying it to our player. So let's do player.components animation. And it's quite a deep dive. So let's even go back to our system. And how we're doing it here is we're going to animation, frames. I'm looking right here, by the way, the last line in this if statement. Frames, facing, move. And then instead of current frame, it's src rect. And let's set that to link animation src rect. Or what we should do actually is we don't need to go deep into src rect. We can actually just go back and just set it to link animation in general. That should be fine. Yes, I think that's actually better because these are all the values that need to be in here anyway. So we can actually just replace it like that. For the original src rect, it's actually move. So we want to do a copy of not just the src rect property, but the num frames, current frame, etc. So I think that looks good. It's not perfect yet, but let's just see what we got. Let's just visualize what it is that's happening. So let me refresh this. So now hopefully when I run into the sword, there will be a change in the animation. It's not a perfect change, but it's there. And he's also keeping the same animation going down. I think that's because I pressed down going out of the sword, so it actually overrided the up and the down animation. Left and right work, but let me just see if I go left and right. Yeah, now this is his animation all the time. Okay, that's fine. We have the proper animation. He's a little off center. Let's play around with that a bit just to get it looking perfect. Let's move him to 147.5. See how that looks. A little better. Link is still a bit off center. So I told you guys earlier that I actually like to use minus values sometimes just to move things and get them centered in the sprite square. So let me just do -2. You guys play around with that at home, but it should be a -2 as well. Or -3. Let's see how this works. I kind of like that placement. So the final two parts are to create the replacement tile and to handle user input. Once we do those two things, we'll have all the pieces together, and then we just need to waste 3,000 milliseconds until the animation is complete, and then return everything to normal. So let me finish setting up this foundation. So please create the replacement tile, and the way to do that, it's very simple. If you guys remember, we're passing in the new tile position component. So luckily we do not need to create a new position component. All we need to do is create const dummy sprite tile component. And we're going to only be passing it a path value because we don't need to specify an src rect. We're using the whole entire sprite sheet for this file. So that would be assets, and then I believe it is shop tiles 0.png. And to be sure, assets shop tiles 0.png. That looks good. However, we do need to go up one, or do we not? Let's see, actually. No, we do not need to go up one. Let's create this dummy replacement tile. Player registry, create entity, dummy sprite tile, and then new tile position component. Let's handle user input. And to handle user input, we're going to go into index.js just to compare. And just how these are add event listeners, we need to remove these event listeners. For this function. Remove the this, and that looks good. Now we'll waste time to have the animation fire, and we'll return things to normal. So waste time, turn to normal. And we're going to do this by utilizing recursion. And I'm going to define a function inside the function, inside the animation function. I'm going to call it. If you're not familiar with recursion, it's when a function has a call to itself from within its own executable code block. You can use this for a variety of purposes. There's a lot of goals you can achieve through the use of recursion. For this, we're going to just be using this to waste time. So what we need to do is compare the time that this animation started at plus 3,000 milliseconds or 3 seconds. We need to compare this end time to the time that it is currently. If the time that it is currently is greater, that means the animation should have elapsed. So if end time is greater than, or no, less than or equal to date now, end the animation. If not, keep animation running. And to keep the animation running, we could call recursion inside of it again. However, what I want to do now is I want to call request animation frame so it will run asynchronously instead. Also, while the animation is running, we do want to keep link static. We want to limit any kind of velocity he could potentially have. So let's set his velocity to 0. Before, we had not yet prevented him from having velocity. If we remove key up without setting the velocity to 0, he can still have velocity from the key down remove event listener line that we wrote. So let's set this to, it should be movement, Vx, Vy. Once the animation is complete, we want to set things back to normal. So we want to undo the things that we did. So let's undo those things. The first thing that comes to my mind is just right here. Let's just re-add these event listeners. Remove this. Cool. So that's the first thing that we should add back. Let's set the player animation frames facing move. We'll set it back to the original SRC. Original SRC. And then this sword entity, I know it doesn't look very good on the screen. We need to fix how that looks. Let's add this to the entities to be killed or removed property, because we only needed it to show for those few seconds that it was on the screen for. Moved push sword entity. That looks okay. Let's go back to system.js. I just want to see what we need to make sure that this will render. We need the should animate property be true. So while the animation is running, we want to be able to still access it, access this block. So let's go into player components, animation, go to should animate. We'll set that to true. And now let's see what we have. Okay. So Link strikes the pose. He does the animation. However, we have two problems. The first problem is that he does not come out of it, so there must be an issue with our ending logic, that if statement. And the second issue is the sword looks really weird. I think we just have a misalignment on the source rectangle. So why don't we go back and we will fix the source rectangle first. Let's take a look at the Link PNG again. We can look at this. So I'm going to guess and say we need to actually go down a bit further on this sprite sheet. Let's go back and check. I put in 190 for the Y. And there the sword is. Although it's very small, we're getting the sword. Let's change around the height and the width. Let's make it a little bit wider and a little bit taller. Let's see what it looks like now. Okay, we're getting better. It's still a very little sword. Why don't I make it much longer? I'll do 60 height. I'll leave the width the same. Okay, it's not bad. I'll just put it to the side right here. How about we even do it to 75 height? I actually like that a little bit more. Let's make it wider. Okay, I like how that looks. Let's move it up slightly. Move it up by a few pixels. Actually, we need to move it. We need to subtract 35 to move it up. See, a lot of this is a bit trial and error. If I was able to find good sprite sheets that were proportioned out properly, it would have been slightly better with this part, but you work with what you got. And it's not too bad. Let's move it over to the right a bit more. Ooh. To the right means less, actually. Okay, that's on his hand, right? That's not too bad. Shift the pixels down a little bit more. Cool. Now it looks like he's actually holding it by the handle. That looks good. I like that. Now, you guys play around with it. If you want it to look exactly like the sword model, you can go ahead and do that. I personally like how this looks, so I'm going to keep it like that. I might just make it slightly less wide. Yeah, I like it like that. I think that looks good. So cool. That's our first problem. And our second problem was that we are not exiting the animation. So obviously there is an issue with this if statement. The end time is, or the date now is never greater than the end time. I have a feeling that means that the end time is also incrementing, even though it's taking this timestamp, which makes sense because actually this Link pickup sword, if we go into the system, let's Let's go into the action system. What I'm pretty sure is happening right here is that since Link, that tile, that sword tile that Link is hovering over, is constantly intersecting with Link because we haven't removed it. So this update function is constantly getting called because they intersect, which pushes this event, which fires this. So we're constantly running this animation, and Link is frozen in that place. That's my hypothesis. And I think the way we fix it is by removing that tile, the tile that has the sword, and we do the replacement. So if you remember, I actually had predicted this was going to, well, not this specific issue, but I did say earlier that we would need to get rid of the original tile, and that's why we were passing this ID property to the Link pickup sword function. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to, right after the replacement tile is created, let's do delete the original tile. And we're going to do player registry. And we can say remove entity by ID. And we pass the ID. Now we don't actually have this function yet. So let's go into the registry class and let's create this function. Now we can handle this in one of two ways. One, we can loop through every single system, go through every single entity within the system, and determine if the entity has that ID to remove it from the system. That's actually a bit cumbersome for what we needed to do. Now, both of these methods would actually be great methods to have in a big game, and perhaps we'll code out a general one later. But for right now, what I want to do is I actually just want to have a second parameter with the system that we would like to remove the entity from. So let's go and we will create this function, entity by ID. We'll make the first parameter ID and the second parameter system type. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the system. So this system's system type, and we'll loop through the entities. So for let I is equal to 0 is less than system entities dot length. And what I want to do now is if the ID is equal to, and actually let's just get the specific entity system entities I is equal to entity.id, remove the entity, right? Removing the entity is a little bit tricky with an array because what's going to happen is if this entity is in the middle of the array, we can remove it, but then there's going to be this blank empty value that will exist in the array. And that's not good coding because although we're not dealing with a large number of entities, when you have a huge system and you just leave empty spaces in arrays that have no values, you're actually creating kind of a memory leak where you're using up more and more memory and you're not doing anything with it. And those kinds of techniques, those kind of bad techniques, will impact performance. So what we actually want to do is we want to set the system entities to well, we're going to splice out the entity that has the same ID, and then we're going to kind of concatenate both halves of the array to form a new entities array. Up front, this actually is a bit of a costly operation to perform, but as a game grows larger and larger, this is a better technique than to just have memory leaks in your application like this. So system.entities, splice. And how splice works is we'll start at 0. We'll take from the beginning of the array until the place where the element is that we want to remove, which we can find by just placing I here. And then we'll concatenate from I on. or actually from I plus 1, so we'll skip over that. And what happens is, let's say we have an array like this, and we want to get rid of C. We essentially, what we're doing is we're splicing from 0 until 0, 1, 2. And it will not take C, it'll just take A and B, because it's the splice argument, the second argument is actually just asking us for the number of elements it wants to take. So it'll take out A and B. And then we concatenate from 2 plus 1, which is 3, and this will be 3, until the end. And actually, I just realized I need to concatenate. I need to make a longer statement than that. It needs to, again, be system entities splice. And we'll concatenate the resulting array from this to this array. And what I'm going to do is I will do console.log out entity, or actually system entities before system entities, and then we'll just do an after to determine that what I'm doing is right. Okay. Remove entity by ID. Okay. Now let's see how this looks. If we get any errors. Okay. And here, let's try that again. Nothing is being console logged out. So something is not working properly. We're passing the actionable system in the ID. I know for certain that actionable system is the correct type. So I'm assuming we're getting system, but for some reason, perhaps we're not getting or maybe we're not getting the proper ID. Let me console.log out ID. Let's see what we get. ID is undefined. Okay, so ID is not being properly passed from index.js. ID is right here. This registry num of entities. Is that the name of the property? Number of entities. Okay. Number of entities. Now it should work properly. Let's try this again. Entities before and entities after. Okay, so the very cool. Okay, so the entity is properly being removed from that system. However, the sword is still displaying, and that's because we're only removing it from one entity, or from one system rather. So let's also remove it from the render system. And after we remove it from the render system, I'm going to want to push it into the entities to be removed array of the registry. So why don't we also return this array, or return this entity, and we'll just take it from here. Const entity is equal to player registry. Do player registry entities to be removed, and we can push it right in. Because now we don't need to do this with everything, but I have a feeling that we may have situations in the future where if we remove it from 2 of the systems it's supposed to be in, we may want to just get rid of all the systems that it has to be in, and we might want to do this to remove it from multiple systems. Let's change this to render system as well, because I copy pasted that. Okay. And that looks good. Let me check this. Okay, splice is not the right method. It's actually slice. I'm sorry, I get those mixed up sometimes. Splice will alter the array in place, while slice takes just a shallow copy of it to perform its actions on. I think that's better. Let me save that. Let's go back to our game. Cool. And that's what we want. That looks good. We'll refresh it again, just make sure. Link is still running. We can easily fix that by setting the should animate to false when this is over, but that looks good. I like it. Let me do a different direction. Yep. And then all we need to do, so let's remove the sword once the animation is complete. We'll take this sword entity, end the animation. Looks like we're already pushing this to be removed. Okay, so we'll fix that issue in a little bit. And then let's just set player components animation should animate to false. Let's see how that works now. Okay, he's holding that pose maybe too long. Let's go back. So we're setting the animation to false. Since it's the should animate is set to false, if we go to our system, let's check out how our animation system is working. It's only running if it's set to true, so actually the animation system is not really having any effect. However, our render system controls when Link is not moving, or at least it's rendering Link. Yeah, it's rendering Link when he's not moving. So you know what we actually need to do is we need to change this src rect directly as well. So let's go into player components sprite src rect. And let's actually just set this equal to src rect and the first frame of that. Let's see how that looks now. He does the animation and then he returns to normal. Everything works properly. Now the final piece of the puzzle, let's get rid of that entity, the floating sword that is just in the middle of the screen. So just like we were handling the entities to be added, let's go through the entities to be removed. And this remove entity from system. We're going to create this entities to be removed, set it to an empty array. We are going to create this method. We'll put it right here, remove entity from system, and we'll take an entity. So what we want to do now is remove this entity from every system. So we need to loop through all the systems. So let's just do this. We'll go let I is equal to 0. Or actually, we don't even need to use this kind of for loop. We'll loop through the this system's property. And then for each system, we're going to essentially filter out the specific entity from its entities. So we can do something like system entities filter. We can take advantage of JavaScript's filter function. If the entity ID, or let's change the name of this, if sys entity ID does not equal the entity ID that we're trying to remove, then we can put it back into the system. And I think that should be good. Let's console.log this out. Console.log entity. Yep, very nice. It's a fluid animation. It disappears right when it's supposed to. So now that Link's animation is complete, we can get to more of the fun stuff, which is adding the weapon to Link's inventory and creating an animation that will allow Link to swing it. There are a few things that we need to think about when we're going about creating this kind of feature. So the first thing we need to think about, obviously, is how this is going to affect the render system. So we're going to need to render the sword on the screen when he presses the swing sword button, which on the Nintendo would be the A, but we can choose a key for that on the keyboard. The second thing we want to think about is where are we, storing this data, right? So we're going to create a component that will hold what information, or the information of the sword, so the damage, the SRC rect, that kind of stuff. And then we also need to think about, and this we'll think about actually a bit later, is how it interacts with enemies. And we'll also be thinking about inventory. So in a little while, we're actually going to get to Link having a specific inventory where we're going to hold the information for how many bombs Link has, what other weapons does Link have? Does Link have the boomerang or the wand, etc.? So very exciting stuff is coming up. And while we're still on this topic of animation, we still have this file open. What I would like to do is I actually would like to create the sword object, which includes the SRC rect dimensions that we'll be using. We're not going to store this in animations.js. What I will like to do, though, is I do want to create a new folder. Let's call this folder weapons. And we can just name this weapons.js. And in here, we are going to create a sword object. And we can call this sword1 just to stay with the pattern we've been using to describe this weapon. And this object is going to have a few different properties. So let me comment out a little space that we can work with. It is going to have 5 properties, and these properties are going to vary in their types. The first property is going to be a string, and we'll set it to sword1. And this string property will allow us to match this object to other places in our game. So when we want to initialize this object, we can simply just write sword_1, and we'll be able to find this object right from that string. The next property we're going to have is src rect, which you're probably familiar with at this point. But this time, instead of it being an array of objects like how it works in our other src rect properties, this is not going to be an array of objects. It's going to work by being an object with properties of other objects, and these other objects are going to be the directions that Link is facing in. Because when we call this property and we want to render the sword on the screen, we want to know which one of these swords we want to render. So we have an up, down, left, right sword. So we need to know where they are on the sprite sheet. So it's going to look like up, X, Y, width, height, down, left, right. Left, right. Next, we're going to have the image property. This will start off as undefined, but later we're going to set it to a new image object, and this image is going to contain the actual image of the sword that's being swung. The next property will be path, and that's going to look something like assets link.png. And this is going to lead to the link.png sprite sheet that we're using for the sword. And finally, we're going to have a damage property. So this will just be a number of 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And we're using this property to determine how much damage we should be dealing to the enemy when the hitbox overlines with the enemy. And we'll go into hitboxes a little bit later. But that's generally what we're going to be dealing with this object. So let's now put these values into the sword object. src rect. We can pretty much just follow this to a T. Don't forget commas. We need to determine these values in a second, and I will. Set image to undefined. The path is equal to assets link.png. And the damage, we can just set it to 1 for right now. We'll deal with damage later. So now let's set up some actual values. And before we get to up, actually, why don't we deal with this in order? So we'll start with down, left, up, right, because that's the order of the swords. And so here we are. We need to determine where it is on the sprite sheet. I think last time for this link animation, we decided that it looked a little bit better being -2. The sword isn't exactly as wide as link is, but why don't we stick to that? Because I think that might be the right way to go about this. We can do -2, or even let's do -1 because it isn't as wide. We'll just move it very slightly to the left. The next value, where was the sword here? We used 190. Why don't we try that as well? And then for width, let's do 37.5. Or actually, we need to invert the height and the width because the sword is now, the long way is horizontal. It's no longer vertical. Or actually, no, that's not correct. No, we need this to be 37.5, and this is 75. Yes, because it's going down. Here, it'll be the long way for going to the left, while the width will be 75. Y will be 90 because it's on the same row. And then for the X, let's shoot for about 30-ish. Let's go 30 because I know that most of the sprites are about 20 to 30 pixels wide and long. We'll play around with that, see how that works. We'll move over by 30 again. Keep with the same Y. This width is 37.5. The height is 75. Then to the right, let's do 90. Width again is 75. Height is 37.5. Okay, I think that's fine for right now. So now that we have this set up, we need to add the item to the inventory. Now ideally, I think it would be best is if we do that within this animation. I mean, that makes sense to me, right? We can structure this in a multitude of ways. We can set up this animation to fire an event. But to keep it simple and to avoid passing yet another parameter into this link pickup sword animation, I think we could just add the item to link's inventory in this animation. So that sounds great, but we need to create some kind of inventory system. And how we've structured this game so far is using the ECS design pattern. And the way we hold data is through the use of components. So why don't we go into our component file and let's make another component for link. And we can call this the inventory component. So class inventory component extends component. Okay. And we're going to have an inventory object. So as this game goes on, Link will be acquiring more and more items, right? He's going to have a sword. Well, he's going to have multiple swords. One will replace the other. But he's going to have a sword to begin. So we can have a sword, and we can set this to undefined. And eventually, this sword object will go into this key right here. So this object will be the value for this key. While we're at it, let's also think about a few other small things. So he's going to have bombs, and that's going to take a number. So we can set this to 0. He's also going to have rupees, 0, and keys, 0. Now he's going to have the wand later, the candlestick, all that stuff, the boomerang. But for right now, we'll keep it to these 4 main items. And there's 2 other things that we want to think about with the inventory. Those 2 things are the active A weapon and the active B weapon. Now, Link always has his active A set to the sword. Since from the moment he picks it up in the beginning of the game to the very end of the game when you kill Ganon, the sword is always the active A. That's easy. The active B is a little bit different. You can sometimes not have active B items. So we'll just leave this to undefined at the moment. Well, both of them will be undefined, but very shortly, active A will pretty much always have a value. Let's pass this to the export object. And then let's go to the registry and make sure that the registry can pick up on this. Case inventory, const component object, new entity components, inventory is equal to new inventory component, component name, component object, break. Let's go into index.js and let's add this component in the create player function. Inventory dummy, inventory component, name, inventory. And really, this actually doesn't need a component object because everything will be undefined upon creation. So we can just call it inventory. Dummy inventory component. Cool. This player. Let's go to our game. Make sure that that inventory component is being created. That looks good. Cool. So let's go into our animations.js in order to add this sword to Link. And at the end, we can simply just do player components inventory sword is equal to sword1. Export default, or no, we'll do export sword1, and we can set it to sword1, and we'll also set the active inventory active A to sword1 as well, just like that. Let's console.log out the player. Oh, it cannot find weapons. So there's a problem with the path and animations.js. It's because it's missing its file ending. So this player, of inventory. Okay, let's see what's going on. It's probably just a misspelling. Let's see. Yes. Right there. Console log on creation. Console log this out. So inventory on creation. It's undefined. And then let's see the player at the end. Sword active A. Sword right here. Perfect. That's great. And has the values that we set up for it. Let's clean up some of these console.logs because the next part is going to be not complicated, but we're going to need to test out a few things now that we're going to handle the rendering of the sword on the screen. So let's remove all console logs. And what we're going to do next is we are going to now add a property to the animation component that will determine when Link is attacking. Let's go into the animation component. And this property will determine if we're using the attack or the move values. So this is attacking A, or just is attacking for right now. We will get to the is attacking B later. Component, let's make it is attacking A because later we're going to have is attacking B. So component object is attacking. We could just set this to false because upon initialization, he will not be attacking. And how this is going to work is whenever we press a button, maybe it can be V or C, we will flip this flag. So let's go down into the handle user input. There we go. And let's add a switch case for this situation. So let's add a case for V. We can make the attack button V. And let's get, we already have the player animation component, so we're good with that. let's do player animation component is attacking A is equal to true. And we'll also set the player animation component current time of animation equal to date now. And we will only have this happen if the player animation component is attacking is equal to false. And the reason why we're doing that is we don't want Link to be able to just spam sword swings, right? We want to have the animation complete and Link reset back to normal and then be able to swing his sword again. So that's how we're going to do this. And we're going to add a case here for key up. So key up V. And here we will set the player animation component is attacking A equal to false. And the current time of the animation component, current time of animation, just equal to 0 for right now. Let's see how that works. When we go into system, we'll go to the animation system and we will pull this value out, is attacking A. Oh, and I need to add is attacking A right here as well. Is attacking, just making sure I didn't forget anything. A, okay. Is attacking A. We'll set this as the other possible parameter for animating. And then we have that set. Let's go to our render system. Scroll up to render. And in here is how we're going to be handling the rendering of the sword on the screen. So this logic gets a bit tricky. So feel free to slow down the video and leave a comment down below if you have any questions on how this works. But essentially, we're going to be writing the logic to swing the sword in this if statement. And we're going to first determine if the sword is being swung and if this is the proper entity to even concern itself with attacking. So the first thing we want to do is we want to see if there is an inventory component, because the only entity that will have an inventory component is Link. And let me do this. Let me just const entity, this entity's I. And I'm going to remove that entity components. So if inventory, and we also want the animation component. So if we have an animation component and a inventory component, and animation dot is attacking A is true, then we want to handle the sword swing. So the logic is if there is inventory, it must be Link. If there is an animation component and that is attacking A is set to true, we must be handling a sword swing. In order to render the sword on the screen, we need to know where Link is, which we actually already have right here. And then we also need the sprite of the sword. And if you remember, in weapons.js, we have the sprites right here, or the ones we think will be correct. And we're currently organizing them by the direction that Link is facing in. So let's get his facing, the facing property. And this resides in the animation component. And we can set up a switch case for the possible values of facing. I'll let my editor handle that. Facing. So the 4 possible values are up. And actually, let's just handle it by that order that we defined in the weapons.js. So we'll start with down, and then left, up, and then right. And the default value can be break. And within each one of these cases, we're going to define the sprite and the position component in order to create that entity at the end of all this. So let dummy position sword component dummy sprite position component undefined. Or actually, they won't be undefined because we know that they will have their name. Just the value will be undefined. So let's think about this logically now. When we are swinging the sword and Link is facing down, where do we want the sword to appear? Well, to me, I want the sword to appear in the middle of his body, like he's thrusting it outwards from the center of his sprite. So I need to position the X value for his position component, or for the sword's position component, in the middle of his body. And how we do that is we will let X equal to the X position of Link, or let's change this, sword X, so it's clear. The X position of Link plus the width of Link, but divided in two. So it's not the full width, it's half the width of Link. And on top of that, we're going to subtract the width, or half the width of the sword, because the sword is going to be in the middle of Link. And if we put the full width of the sword into this X value, it's actually going to push the sword too far off to the right. So let's play around with this value by just subtracting 15 for right now. And for the sword's Y, it's a similar idea. We're going to set it to the player's Y. However, this will be plus the player's height, because we want it to be at the very bottom of Link's sprite. But it won't be too far away from the bottom of Link's sprite. So why don't we we'll just subtract the 15 off of that. Because the sword, the bottom of Link's sprite is actually going to be at his feet, and we want it to look like it's coming from his hand. And his hand is not going to be, I'll pull up Link. Oh, I'll pull up the Link PNG. The bottom of the sword is not actually going to be right in his hand. Or sorry, the bottom of the sword is not going to be right at his feet. The sword is actually slightly into his body. And also, just as a quick note, we won't be using this actual sprite, and the reason why is because it's a much longer sprite than the running animation, and because we're doing collision by squares and rectangles, it doesn't really work so well with our game in the system the way we set it up. So I'm actually just rendering a sword inside of Link's body instead. So we're going to take this animation, the third from the top, and we're going to render a sword in his hand. Once we have these values, we'll want the sword to be a specific height and width. Let's just set it to 30 or 20, and we'll set the height to 40 to start. Then we will set the dummy position component value equal to X sword Y width height. And I'm going to change this to sword width and sword height. Sword width, sword height. Now let's try doing the left. So let sword X be equal to the X value I think is appropriate, because if we're looking at Link like a square, we pretty much just want to put it in his hands right over here. And this is more or less the first value, the first pixel to his left. And then for let sword Y, we essentially want to go to the Y, but then subtract about half of Link's height. So Y plus height divided by 2. And again, we have to take into account the height of the sword as well. So let's subtract by about 15 just to make sure that we can get it relatively centered into Link's body. We'll set the sword width to 20 and let sword height equal to 40. You know what, actually? Let's set these after. And we'll do sword width divided by 2. Sword height divided by 2. I think that's a smarter way to do this. Plus 15 wouldn't make perfect sense because it's not half of 40. Sword height divided by 2. The next position we want to think about is up. So let sword width be equal to 20. Let sword height be equal to 40. And actually, the width is going to be greater than the sword height on the left and the right. So make sure that the sword width is 40, sword height is 20 for left and right. Then it'll be just up and down will be the same, and then left and right will be the same for the sword width and the sword height. Then for let sword X, we can set it to X plus half the width minus the sword width divided by 2. And then let sword Y just be equal to the Y value. I think that looks right. Then for the right, let sword width be equal to 40. Let sword height be equal to 20. And for the right, we're going to do let X or sword X equal to X plus the width because it's all the way to the right. And let sword Y is equal to Y plus the height divided by 2, subtracting sword height divided by 2. I'm sure this isn't perfect. We're going to test this out in a second. Just letting you guys know, I'm aware that the calculations may not be perfect. We will see when we create the entity what we need to fix. But that looks good enough. And then once that is done for the position component, we can simply just render the sprite component by going into this sword constant and just picking out the specific src rect that we need to based on the direction that Link is facing. Now this whole switch statement, this was just for putting the sword in the place that it needs to be when Link swings it. So if Link is on the top left of the screen, it needs to appear in the top left, for example. Now we're actually going to be getting the sprite. So dummy sprite component, or we should do dummy sprite component value is equal to sword1 src rect facing value. So it'll get that object. So if he's facing down, it's going to get this one. If he's facing left, it's going to get that one. And then with that, we can create the entity. And we can access the registry just from the entity that's being looped through. Registry, create entity. Dummy position component, dummy sprite component. We'll return this. Sword entity. Okay, we can console.log out this sword entity. Okay, so let's go through this. We actually did not need that. Therefore, we do not need this. I initially thought perhaps we would take those src rect values from weapons.js, but that was incorrect. Src rect is for sprite. This src rect is for sprite, while this is for the position. And then for... Although, did we need the active A? No, it does not seem like we did. An active A is actually an animation anyway, so that wouldn't, or it's not an animation, it's in the inventory system, inventory component. Let's see what we got. Okay. Animation works. We get a not found. Okay. Let's see the sprite. src rect is undefined. Okay, that's fine. Let me see if the src value, yep, undefined. Okay. Let's go back then. And that is because we actually are not passing in this path right here. We are only passing in this object, so this dummy sprite component does not have its path. A dummy sprite position component, that is not right. Dummy sprite sword component. Let's not get confused on what it is. Value is equal to sword 1 path. Path is equal to okay, let's try that again. So a sword entity is being created. Okay, that's good. It's not showing up on the screen yet, but it's there. The src rect is undefined now. Okay, so something is going wrong. Let's see what the src value is. Looks like it's going into assets.link.png. Okay, so that's working. That's good. And I think that should be correct. I think the problem is we're not passing this src rect properly. What's going on here? We need to set the value of src rect like that, because it takes src rect right here, and then it takes a path right there. Okay, I think that should be better. Cannot set properties of undefined src rect. Okay. Well, that's good. It's a new error. So sword 1 is, it says it's undefined. Let's go to our system. I think it's saying that this value is undefined, which it doesn't like that. So I think we should just set these two empty objects instead. And here's the problem. We need to add a Y. Let's try again. Ah, very good. Okay. It's not exactly what we want, but hey, at least we have something coming up on the screen now. Cool. It looks like to me we're taking a lot from the sprite sheet. This is probably a little too much, right? We're getting all the swords and other items that are on the sprite sheet. So we need to fix the source rectangle for the sprite sheet. So let's go to source sword 1. And now we need to realize that perhaps the height is a little bit too great. We'll test it with just one thing though. Let's just do height 40. It's taking too much of the sprite sheet. So we'll test that out. Okay, that's a little bit better. We can see that it's looking closer to us. I think the width is definitely too wide as well too. So why don't we lower it by a lot just to see what we got going on. Okay, he picked up the sword. Let's test it. Oh, that's pretty good. Although I think our calculations were a bit off when we did the when we decided where the sword would show up on the screen, but that's fine, one problem at a time. I think I want to make the width a bit wider and actually, believe it or not, make the height smaller. Let's move it to the left slightly and move it down as well by 2. Or sorry, that will move it to the right. To move it to the left, we go negative. Now let's see. Now that's not wide enough. It looks more like an arrow. I think we need to make it a little wider. So each tile is about 70, I think it's 75 pixels we set it to. Let's set this to 50. Oh, let's go. We're messing with down first. Let's set this to 50 and then we'll set the height to 60. Ah, see, that looks much better. The placement of the sword obviously is not in the hands of Link. So let's fix that. I'm going to take a moment to myself to get these values correct for you guys, so that way you can easily just put them in at your leisure versus experimenting through all of this with me. See you in a minute. Hey guys, so I'm back. I have fixed the values to make it what we need them to be, and I'll just demonstrate what it's looking like right now. If we go to the sword, now we still don't have the animation for Link to actually stick out his arm, but the placement will be correct once that is in place, once the little swing animation is there. So when you swing up, the sword is right there, to the right, down, to the left. And that's what we want. So of course we have all these swords on the screen. We need to get rid of these as well, but we got it appearing, which is good. Here are the values for both the system.js and the weapons.js. Feel free to pause the video and to go through each value. It took just trial and error for me to get this just perfect. Take your time, go through this, look through each one. I changed both down, left, up, and right in the system.js, and I changed it in the weapons.js as well. So pause this video, and when you've finished, you can continue. And now that that's done, we can just get rid of the entity that's being created immediately after it's been displayed. Let's push this right back into the registry, the entities to be removed. To be removed, push sword entity Entities to be removed, just making sure that that's properly how you spell it. Yes. In order to properly remove this entity, now we need to store this entity somewhere while it's being used. And we're going to use the existence of this entity to determine if we need to render the sword or if we need to be getting rid of the sword. So I'll show you what I mean. We currently have our component active. We currently have our active A, and this active A looks like this. It takes the sword 1 constant, this object, and we stuff it in here. So it'll have all these values like src rect, name, path, right? Damage. We already did this. There's one more property we're going to add, and I'm going to put this into the sword-1 object, and that object is the weapon entity, and it's going to start off undefined, and this is simply going to be the place where we're actually holding the entity once it's created. So we're going to have weapon entity. That's going to be of type entity. So once this is created, we're actually going to just set inventory active A weapon entity here. And we're only going to do this if inventory active A weapon entity is undefined. So let's take a look at what we are doing currently. And what's going to happen is we're only going to be able to make one sword. You see that? One sword has been created. However, we can't make multiple swords because the weapon entity is now defined. So we will end up setting it to undefined in a bit. And how we're going to do that is simply with an else if at the top of this if statement. So it's going to branch up there. So else if. So if the weapon entity does exist, but we are not attacking, we want to get rid of it. Okay, so if entity components inventory active A, so we have to set it up like that to make sure that active A is not yet undefined to avoid any bugs. Inventory active A weapon entity. So if this is defined and entity components animation is attacking A is not true. It's a bit of a lot of logic, but just stay with me. We want to take this entity, get the registry, and we want to access the entities to be removed and push the entity components inventory active A weapon entity and set this weapon entity again to undefined. Defined. This isn't the end of this animation. However, let's see what we got. Cannot read properties of undefined reading active A 286. Player.components inventory. Okay. Ah, yes, we need another check. It needs to have components inventory because JavaScript is just annoying like that. Let's see again. So it's cool. So it only appears when I'm holding down the button right now. and it will only appear when I'm pressing the button. And you can see Link is even animating. He's not doing the proper animation, but we haven't set that yet. So this looks good. However, I'm holding this out. We don't want Link to just be able to run around and hold the sword out. I mean, look, that's causing a bug already. We want the animation to be complete. We want to get rid of the sword at a specific frame. The way I'm going to structure this, I prefer to have Link, I want Link to have a quick draw. So this animation is going to be composed of 2 frames. The one where he's sticking his sword out and the one where he's pulling it back. You can do it in the reverse order if you prefer, but I think the game responds better to that. So here we want to go and we want to set it, or we want to make this animation cancel on the 2nd frame. So I can go down like this. And how we're going to do that is, if you remember, for each animation that Link will perform, we're keeping track of the current frame. So we want the current frame, so entity components, animation, current frame. We want that to be equal to 1. And on the flip side, we only want this condition, this block of code to fire if the current frame is equal to 0. And actually, since I pulled out animation, current frame, let me refactor this a bit. Weapon entity, animation, and now everything looks good. However, this is the first time that we're utilizing attack versus walk or move. And I do believe that down here in the animation system, if you remember, I did hard code this value of move. So what we need to do is we need to determine if this is move or if we should go down into attack. We can do that very easily by setting a variable called mode. And if is attacking is true, then it's attack. Otherwise, it will be move. And we can replace these values with mode. And now that we have that done, let's just do a last check before we go to the screen. This looks good. Let's see the render system. Animation is attacking, current frame, wait, hold on. It's a lot of complex logic, so it's easy to get lost. Current frame is not at the top of the animation component. So we need to drill down a little bit more. And we can drill down using the same technique that we had done before. So what I'm going to do is I'll pull the facing up here. We also will need the mode, so const mode is equal to is animation is attacking. If yes, then it's attack. If not, it's move. So we can go facing, or actually, we can just copy this. It's not facing, it's frames. Facing. Mode. Current frame. We can just put this in parentheses to keep with the pattern for this. I can just copy this and bring it down here. Okay. And we can actually get rid of this because we can just pull it out of the animation component. And I think what I would like to do is I'd like to do a little bit more refactoring because this will return an error if the entity does not have an animation component. The same with an inventory component. So I think what I'll do is I'll wrap all of this into an if statement and inventory. Just plop it right in here. And then we can actually get rid of some of these, get rid of some of the logic in the if statements. Makes it a little bit cleaner. Const inventory from inventory. Or rather, sorry, we should take out the active A. That's what I want. Very good. Okay, that should clean it up a bit. Let's go and see what we got. Okay. It's not perfect, but it's rendering and then being destroyed right after. Not bad. It seems like when we hold down the button, the sword isn't being sheathed later, so we need to fix that. Let's go back. In systems, we should be removing the sword on the second frame, but for some reason it's actually not working. So I think there's a logic issue in here. I see what the issue is. Now maybe you may or you may not, but let's go through each one of these conditions. So active A and active A weapon entity, we just want to make sure that the sword exists. Okay, that's simple. I'm looking at these two. If we're not attacking, how can we be on the second frame of this? That doesn't make sense. I don't think that actually can work out properly. Let's try adding an OR statement for these two. That looks... Well, let's see how this works. I think this should work. Let's go back. Okay. So the sword is now disappearing. However, it seems like we have two problems. The first problem is that Link is in a stationary position when the animation is complete. And the second problem is not as obvious, but the sword does not seem to appear at the very last, well, when it should appear. It seems like it appears slightly earlier. Let's fix first this position that link is in. And to do that, I think that will be a simple fix. If we go to render system, we can get a better look. Ooh, where is it? Or the animation system, rather. We can get a better look at how this is handling the current frame. Now, it seems like if the should animate value is true or the is attacking A is true, then we determine what the src rect should be. And just by a quick first glance, I can tell that the src rect is stuck on the attack animation, meaning it's not being changed. And that makes sense because when we lift our finger off the attack button, we will no longer be going into this block. So why don't we set the src rect and the current frame when there is no animation going on? So if we should not animate and is attacking A is set to false, and actually this should be an and value. So if should animate is equal to false and if is attacking A is equal to false, let's take src rect and we'll take this, we'll set it equal to still wherever, whatever direction link is facing in, but move, and we'll set the current frame to 0, and we'll take this value and set this to 0 as well. Let's go back. Oh, let's go back. Mode is undefined. My passing mode, yes. Change this to move. Now let's go back. Okay, it seems like Link, he now returns to his stationary walking movement. Okay, that looks pretty good. So we solved one problem. However, we still have a weird bug where this sword, if I press it really fast, this sword doesn't seem to render right when it should. It kind of pops up a little bit earlier. Now, this is a tricky problem. This is something I've encountered in the past as well before too. So I have an idea as to what's going on. Now, in the ECS design architecture, and this is just a guess, I'm going to go to our code editor to see, we need to always render last. We handle the updates of all of the data before we do the rendering. So that includes the position, the movement, and the animation system as well. And I have a feeling that we may be rendering before we're animating because the sword looks like it's popping up right before the animation begins. And since this is all working synchronously, it's possible that it's being rendered right before the animation because things happen one after another in a synchronous system like this game. Let's go to index.js and I see that in the render function, I have the animation system update after the render system. So that's a mistake. I actually, now, as long as I put it up above, it should fix this issue. But you know what? I want to put this above everything, and I want to put it at the top just to give the system plenty of time to animate Link and his sword. I think that should work and fix our problem. Now, this is only something I know because I have a lot of experience of setting up this kind of design pattern and of programming games. So if this wasn't an obvious thing to you, that's fine. It wouldn't have been obvious to me on the first time that I encountered this issue. Let's see it work again. Okay. That looks a little bit better, I think. What do you think? I think it looks good. It's not perfect. I think the spacing of the sword is still not 100% where it should be, but it's like 98% the way there, and I think that's good enough for us to continue. Feel free to play around with the pixel spacing if you'd like.